Will Hurd, welcome to our Zoom leadership series. It's absolutely great to see you again and to have you on today.
Look, it's a pleasure to be on, and I'm looking forward to this chat.
So you've done lots of great things, and I hope to get to all of them. But probably, even if you're president of the United States, when all's said and done, the coolest job may be your first working at the CIA. And I was always interested, in the movies and the books. Recruiters come to college and find the really smart kids. Nobody ever talked to me in college, so maybe that is the way it works, but it wasn't me. I'm curious, how'd they find you, or how'd you find them, and what pre 9/11 helped you decide that's what you wanted to do?
Well, Bruce, I've seen your file, and we can talk about some of the things you've done in your past. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. I had been exposed to Southwest Research Institute. This was the largest private research entity in the United States, and there was a Dr. Jill Marshall blew me away, made me want to study computer science. I learned about robotics. I thought I was going to be a programmer. And I'm at Texas A&M my freshman year. I've never really been outside of Texas at this point in my life. And I see a sign that says on one of the walls in the campus to take 2 journalism classes in Mexico City for $425. I had $450 in my bank account, so I go to Mexico, right? I fell in love with being in another culture. It was cool seeing things I only read about in books. And I added international studies as a minor. The first class I took in international studies, there was a guest lecturer who was a former CIA tough guy, right? He was the former deputy director for operations for counterintelligence. He was the head of counterintelligence for the agency when he retired. He was a deputy chief of staff in Moscow. He was chief of staff in Mexico City. And he told these amazing stories. And when I think back of the stories he told about getting beat up in Moscow by the KGB, or his dog literally being killed while he was on assignment. He told these amazing stories. And the next day, I went to his office, knocked on his door, and said, "Tell me more." And that began my interest. So I applied, and then at the time, when I was in school, the Bush School was created at Texas A&M, and the interim head of the Bush School was Bob Gates. And so I got introduced to Bob Gates, and he talked to me about the directorate operations, and then I interviewed, and the rest is history. And it really is the greatest job I've ever had. And to be frank, it was probably my easiest job. It's the one job I knew who your enemies were, who your friends were, right? You know who had your back, who didn't have your back. Since then, it's always, depending on the day of the week, those things may be different.
All right, so that's how you joined the CIA. Question 2 was, what brought you to the GOP? And in my case, for example, I went to high school. Ronald Reagan was president. I always liked his sunny optimism. I thought his peace through strengths foreign policy was right. My dad's a Republican and very much my hero in a lot of ways. Dad, don't come off mute. Stay on the call, but stay on mute. I'm curious, Will, for you, what led you to join?
I might say it was like from osmosis, right? When I was a kid, we weren't in a political household, but my dad was always a Republican. My dad's Black, my mom's white. My dad grew up in East Texas in a place called Marshall. And during the Civil War, the most important city to the Confederacy west of the Mississippi was Marshall, Texas. This was the ground zero for Reconstruction in Texas after after the Civil War, and so you had an influx of Republicans. So my father's father, my father's grandfather were completely influenced by that. And my dad would always say he was a Republican since Lincoln Freedom, right? And so you have that. My dad and my mom started a small business when I was in high school, so I saw them, bootstrapping a beauty supply business. And then I get to Texas A&M and get involved in student politics because somebody told me that was a great way to meet a lot of people on campus. And I got to meet folks like Rick Perry, who was the agriculture secretary at the time. I got to meet George W. Bush when he was governor and had a lot of interactions with him. But I also had, this is when the Bush School was created, as I said earlier, and a real interaction with a George H.W. Bush 41. And I can say that, that was one of the highlights of my career in college. So I was exposed to all of these folks that I would say were conservative. And then being in the CIA and understanding the threats to our country and the importance of having a strong foreign policy and national security plans, I think that is what kind of influenced all my decisions. And I've also, when you realize like some of the core tenets of a party, and some of these core tenets we've gotten away from, to be frank, the concentration of power in the hands of a few is not a good thing. That freedom, it actually leads to opportunity. That opportunity allows for growth, and growth leads to progress. Like understanding that chain, those are the things that I made me realize that I'm a Republican.
Well, so you touched on the modern GOP, and that sort of begs the question: what's keeping you in the party? And I'm asking for a friend, by the way. But when I think of your time, I mean, you were thoughtful, you were principled, you were thoroughly sane. You were buddies with Beto. For you, like me, the Democrats are the loyal opposition and many of your best friends. And yet, increasingly, the party, and the Boehner, who's doing his book tour somewhere, was the kind of guy who's a conservative guy, but he's a legislator. And increasingly, it feels like folks who think the role of the Republican Party is to quote unquote own the libs, try to dunk on opponents on social media, kind of embracing conspiracy, something you wrote about on your way out. And I'm hoping you might give me and others here some hope. Is it redeemable? And how do we turn it around so the party is again the party you joined, the party your dad was part of, more of a principled place?
So I always tell folks, when I was in, I would say the president is not my boss. The Speaker of the House is not my boss. Whoever the hell the head of the RNC is not my boss. My boss are those people that I represent, right? And so for me, when I think of what is the Republican Party, it's those folks that I've had the benefit of interacting with, from super diverse, physically, philosophically. That to me is the party. And so, how can a Black Republican in a 71% Latino district continue to get reelected? Is because people, I was reflecting the principles and things that they believe in, right? And so while the leaders of our party are espousing some of those things that you're talking about, I actually think they're disconnected from the majority of voters. Now, we got to make that distinction between primary voters and general election voters. But when you look at, I still believe that 80% of Americans are focused on these issues of, putting food on the table, roof over their head, and making sure the people they love being healthy and happy. I think 2020 election was the two outcomes from that. And I've said this before, pardon my, don't be a jerk and don't be a socialist, right? There's some real opportunities to appeal to the middle of the country and conservative Democrats. And we're failing to do that because we're so afraid of a minority of total voters, of a minority of primary voters, but they're the loudest voice. And look, Twitter is not a reflection of the majority of where Americans are. So, cable news is not a reflection of that. So I don't listen to all that stuff, right? And try to stay focused. And when people come up to me when I'm pumping gas and say, "Hey, Will, thanks for doing this," this is what makes me feel good. And so that's why I stay, because I do believe that you mentioned Beto. When we did the road trip, which was like 4 years ago, a few weeks ago, it was March 17. 25 million people watched on our socials, right, over the span of a day and a half, of 36 hours, 35 hours. We were literally on every news program. And then, from that high, we get to some of the most hateful conversation speech. So I would say that's still an indication that people are craving this kind of thing. So I'm going to stay and fight. I hope others stay and fight, because there's more like us. We may not always see them on cable news or on Twitter feeds, because you got to get things done. It takes work. and you can't always be playing on your social feeds.
So let me ask you about that, because I, as we were emailing about, I loved the road trip. It felt like the best of America, the best of, a young Republican and a young Democrat, kind of having fun, singing songs, calling their families, being goofy, letting everybody road trip with them. And I really did love that. So you take where we are, you take what that reflects, which I agree with you. I think the reality is there is the middle is the heart of America is rational. The problem is the middle is also politically a bit milquetoast. And it begs the question of, is the problem the general lack of passions within the middle? We need them to rise up. Or is the problem some of the systemic, how things are organized? Well, an earlier Zoom, we had Catherine Gale, who along with Michael Porter of Harvard, wrote a great book called The Politics Industry. And their thesis is politics isn't broken. The system's working the way it's designed. We've got to redesign the system. And so their big idea is make it an open primary. The final the five highest vote getters in the primary are all in the general, and then you have a ranked choice approach to the general. And what that does is it takes away this problem of the primary voters are the most intense and the most extreme. And so the folks in the middle, who often don't really get excited until it's the general and it's too late, might have more of a voice. What do you think of a reform like that, or do you have others?
Sure. So let me give some of my philosophical opinions and get down into some of the tactics. These numbers are around 2018. I haven't compiled the ones for 2020 yet. The average primary total vote count across the country, Republican and Democrat, it's about 42,000 people. Okay, so 42,000 people vote in the primary. In a general election for a member of Congress, it's about 325,000. So 350,000, excuse me, 350,000. So, but in 92% of congressional races, it's decided in a primary. So that means 21,001 people decide who's going to be that person in Congress. And of that group, the biggest group of that are the loud, what I would call the extreme, right? And I call the extreme is not the base. The extreme is a subset of the base. So that's why, in 92 districts, 92% of the districts, Republican or Democrat, they're talking to less than 20,000 people. Right? Now, if more districts were like the district I represent in the 23rd, they were truly 50-50. You would see, so I would agree that the system does not reward compromise. Now, a district like mine does, because if every Republican voted for me, I still wouldn't have enough votes and win. I had to, if my opponents, if they got the same turnout in my hometown of San Antonio, that the president or whoever was on top of the ticket got, I would have been crushed, right? And so how do we get more seats to be balanced? And I think that would be a reform. And if you go back 23 years, so 8% of the districts in 2020 were competitive. So that's 34 seats. 31 seats were Democrats in seats that Donald Trump won, 3 Republicans in seats Hillary Clinton won. If you go back 23 years, that number was about 75. 33 years ago, that number was 92 or something like that. And 40 years before that, it was north of 115, right? And so you saw some different outcomes because I get rewarded for solving problems. Right now, to the earlier part of your question, Bruce. Once I was at a South by Southwest a couple of years ago, and I'm on a panel with a number of YouTube stars, and I don't know why I was on it, because I think I had like 100 followers on my YouTube, and they had a combined 1 billion, literally 1 billion. And one of them was the digital director for The Rock, and Dwayne Johnson. And this was when the movie Moana was coming out. And she said, if Moana comes out and fails, are we going to blame moviegoers for not going to the movie, or are we going to say it's a crummy movie? Right now, I've seen Moana. I think it's a fantastic movie. Right? But politics is the only, and the digital director Rock went on to say, politics is the only profession where if the buyer doesn't come out, we blame the buyer and don't say it's a crummy product, right? So I actually believe that if we had better products, you would see a response. But here's what those folks need. You need infrastructure. We know how to talk to the edge on both the Republican and the Democratic side. Organizations for decades have been crafting email lists, have been crafting messages in order to talk to those people. The political industrial complex, they know that, if you're a general consultant, you want to do the same campaign for 20 races, and you know how to get those 4 or 4 Republican primary voters out, or those 4 or 4 Democratic primary voters out. So there's some infrastructure that is needed in order to get those what I would say normal conservatives that vote in general elections or don't vote to actually understand and participate in the primary. It's hard, right? But I think, and the reality is, we're not going to see a reform in the next year across all 50 states on how to do voting, right? Or how elections are decided, or how maps are drawn. We're not going to see that. So it's going to require some people that come in and fight this notion. We don't have a two-party system everywhere. The problem with a lot of our politics is we have one-party systems. It's, Texas and California are obviously the example, but just polar opposites. And so that is the effort, because ultimately, the way we get big things done in this country is by doing it together. Every major piece of legislation that anybody can talk about over the last 100 years has been done in a bipartisan way. In unified government, there's never anything that's done that stands the test of time. And so part of this is making sure that we have a true competition of ideas that happens in November, because there are some serious generational defining challenges that our country has faced, that if we can't even have a conversation about whether we should wear a mask or get a freaking vaccine, right? How are we going to be able to deal with a China that's flexing its muscle and trying to beat the United States of America in global leadership on advanced technology? Anyway, I don't mean to preach. Sorry, Bruce, but sometimes it's nice to preach to the choir.
You're preaching to the choir for sure. And I'm going to ask you about China in a minute. To your point on product, of course, an earlier one of these Zooms, we had Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland, my home state, which would certainly qualify, one assumes, as a one-state party, Democrats overwhelmingly, and yet he in Maryland, Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, prove that that party label is not the only deciding factor, even if it starts fairly impactful. But you talked about the road trip, and again, I love that. And not only do I think of it as a story about what the politics that could be, the politics of decency, which I love, but it reminds me that the positive power of social media. And there are other ways, and whether it's better awareness of systemic racism or LGBTQ rights, there's just so many ways in which everyone being a witness, everyone being a publisher and an activist can be positive. That road trip, for a brief shining moment, remind everybody that a Republican and Democrat can actually not only like each other and have fun, but get along really well. And part of the reason I think it was so widely covered is because that's not the experience most of us have with a Democrat and a Republican. At the same time, there's lots of things about social media that make politics harder and make life harder. I'm interested in you as a digital native, as a younger member who kind of have seen it at its best and its worst. What's your take on social media? How do we maintain the best, and how do we fix the worst?
Well, first off, I appreciate you thinking I'm a digital native. I'm not that young. My first cell phone was when I was a junior in college, a good old Primeco phone. So I think you have the Arab Spring as another example of positive impacts of social media. There's so many examples. But I just finished reading. I'm on this commission for disinformation at the Aspen Institute, and in some of my prep for this, I was reading the Rand Corporation. They have a new book, Think Peace Out, talking about truth decay, and they talk about how this we don't understand what facts are anymore. The the blending of opinion and facts, and then the information systems that give a increase the volume of that opinions, which are crowding out the ability to discern facts. And then you have educational systems that don't teach people how to evaluate these things. I would say that there's probably examples when radio first came. I think you saw some of the same, everybody thought this was going to be amazing. And then there was some destabilizing effects of radio. I think we're going to figure this out. And I also think it's because Generation Z, they don't trust anything that comes on social media. My generation and older, because they're used to reading something in the newspaper. When you read something, there's this weird psychological connection that this thing is okay. So I think over time we're going to see this. I hope that we get better on this. But this truth decay, this misinformation, disinformation, is, I think, a significant problem, not just for our country, but especially the Republican Party. And until the Republican Party can push back on conspiracy theories and kick those folks out of the party and counter that narrative, it's scary. But why do people believe those things? Why do people the cognitive bias of accepting your own personal experience over facts? We know some of these reasons, but how do you counter that? And I just think more people need to be focused on this issue and how we solve it. I saw, it's a version of radicalization, if we're being honest. I saw radicalization when I was in the CIA. You talk about countering violent extremism, but the difference when ISIS is trying to inspire people to join their ranks via social media, who they're talking to. Their target is very specific. It's teenage boys that are disaffected from their communities or their family. This broader disinformation and misinformation is impacting everybody, and so we're all going to have to figure out how do we deal. And look, everybody at every part of the societal stack has a role to play in this. Why is, when you say something crazy, does that become more viral than not? Right? That there were decisions made in that algorithm to do that. I always tell people, nobody's ever clicked on a link that says Congress worked. Nobody on this call ever clicked on that. And so part of this is the stuff that we see in the news. In local news, you always talk about, if it bleeds, it leads, right? And so these are not old phenomenons. And I'm sorry, Bruce, I'm babbling a little bit here, but this is one of the this is a major issue that all parts of society has to address.
By the way, I wrote an op-ed in January of 2019 looking at the accomplishments of the 1718 Congress, which were way above what people realized. My op-ed was entitled why the state of our union is stronger than you think. It went viral, not because that was appealing, but because it was so unexpected, so unusual, and so weird. I was getting called to go on TV to talk about it because nobody could believe it. Mostly because what I find is so many things. Most people who run for the right reasons. They want to get things done. They're frustrated that they can't. And what happens is, if you can just keep it off the Twitter feed, if you can keep it off the cable shows, there's all this bipartisan cooperation on lots of things. Yeah. The challenge is that the noise captures too much, and once it's sucked into the noise, it can't get done.
Yeah, and Bruce, but on that, right? That's the year old Pablo Ryan was the speaker. Paul's a friend, and I would always tell people that year, I think there was 900 bills signed into law. All but 11 or 13 were done in a bipartisan way. That was a number that most people were blown away by as well. So you have some of those positive examples.
So, and by the way, I would you probably already know Pete Singer at the New America Foundation, who we've had on a couple of Zooms with his new book. But we also had it in the old days. We would do book events in a room with people, and his book, Like War, is really informative for anybody interested in misinformation and how it's, how these kind of campaigns are being used. Maybe the next door neighbor to disinformation and online misinformation is cyber. Somewhere that, your CIA background, you're an expert, and you were very much of a leader in Congress, which kind of scares the hell out of me. I mean, this pandemic's been brutal. We're going to have more than 600,000 Americans dead from it. But at the same time, lots of our economy was able to still work because we're so digitally dependent. And had this been something that wiped out digital systems, oh my God, it would have been total chaos. I'm interested in your take on, is there any reason for hope? And if not, what do you recommend that people do to prepare for what feels like the world's most foreseeable disaster?
So let me tell give a quick history lesson. 2007, there was in Estonia, there was a statue. It's called the Bronze Statue. It was a Russian soldier, and many Estonians saw this statue to be an affront to their independence. The Russian native Estonians loved this, and the Estonian government was going to move it. Created all kinds of chaos and protests. The Russian government took advantage of this, basically brought Estonia to its knees. The government couldn't issue checks. Banks weren't able to operate. It was a complete standstill for multiple days. That incident is what made Estonia realize that, hey, we have to, not only, Tallinn, the capital, is probably an hour and a half tank drive from the border with Russia. And so they changed their ways, right? And what's fascinating, I think 2 months later, Die Hard 4 came out. This was with the whole notion of a fire sale, and everybody was like, oh, that could never happen. And it was like, wait, it literally happened 2 months ago. Then you fast forward to 2014, when the Russians turn off the power in Ukraine. 500,000 people were impacted by that. Then you can talk about what happened with solar winds in the US and the number of cases there. Oh, and then this is still being researched, but a lot of folks are saying that the Chinese government turned off the lights in Mumbai in order to tell the Indian government, cut it out, what the skirmishes and the fighting that's happening on the Sino-Indo border in the northern part of India. So these things, we have to be prepared for them, right? We know it's going to happen, but it starts with, and I see my friend Jenny Rometty on the call. She's probably tired of hearing me talk about what is a digital act of war. Have we defined what a digital act of war is, and what is a response to that digital act of war? And so those are some of the conversations that you have to have. We know that if the North Koreans launched a missile into San Francisco, we know how we would respond. The North Koreans know how we would respond. That's a deterrence measure. But what is the equivalent in the digital world? If in the SolarWinds attack, they stole a lot of information. So is the reciprocal response stealing more of their information? What would have happened if they made those edge devices that were impacted, that stopped them from working, right? What would be an appropriate response there? And so a lot of these conversations have been going on, and there aren't definitive answers, but it has to be a conversation between the public and the private sector, because we can't defend this by ourselves. And so some of the conversations up in Washington, D.C. and what like an anti-business perspective is not going to be helpful, is unhelpful in trying to figure out this level of cooperation that we need in order to defend ourselves from known attacks, let alone stuff that's going to happen in the future. So this is a tricky issue. But look, President Obama focused on this. The folks in the Trump world continue that effort. I think this is one of those areas that most practitioners understand and appreciate, and they're building upon the previous administration's successes and activity. And the threat of China is still a bipartisan issue. The need to defend digital infrastructure is still a bipartisan issue. And as long as it stays that way, we might be able to solve some of these problems.
Boy, I hope you're right. I do worry sometimes. It feels like for government decision makers, they're torn because on the one hand, we've got by a mile the best offensive capabilities that we don't want to give up, but we're concurrently overwhelmingly the most exposed. And so, it's do you trade away your right to use alternatives to actual bombing and such, and do you really gain the protections, or might foes not respect it? It's a tough issue. We were talking with General Petraeus about it 2 weeks ago.
Mhm.
He didn't have the answer either. I'm still hoping somebody's got a 3-point plan. If Ginny's out there, if anybody has a great idea, you do. Um, Let me ask you on China, since you mentioned it. Another book that I've read recently was Graham Allison's Destined for War, which the title alone is scary. But his theory is that, when a rising power runs into an existing power, 12 out of 16 times in history, they've gone to war. China's obviously a rising power. None of us want to go to war. I actually don't think they want to go to war either, but in the 16 times, I don't know how many times leaders actually wanted to. They just kind of ended up there. If the Biden administration, Tony Blinken or the president were to call you and say, hey, what's your advice vis-a-vis what America ought to do about China? What do you recommend?
So first off, we got to recognize that they're a frenemy, right? And I, of those 16 other examples, I don't know how intertwined the cultures, the economies were in those other examples. But when you look at us in China, and I talk about what we're dealing with China as a new Cold War, and we can't. It's not a direct comparison to the Cold War with Russia, because the Russian economy was nowhere near the size of the Chinese or near ours. Our interconnections were nowhere near what they are with the Chinese government or the Chinese people. So this notion that we're frenemies, and our end goal should be to be able to compete with a fair playing field, right? I will take American innovation. I will take great American companies. I will take them any day of the week over an authoritarian system. And so part of this is so recognize the threat that they are. Even when I was in the CIA, and I did stuff against Chinese intelligence officers, things like that, the concept of made in China still meant a knockoff. Now, I would say now made in China means it was made in America, and something was probably stolen in order for them to put in and perfect, but it's no longer a knockoff. And so we have to recognize this notion that they are a near peer, if not a peer. And so, but we also have to work with our allies. If we want to have a level playing field, then that means we got to engage in international organizations. We got to work with our partners, these standard setting bodies around the world that the Chinese government are trying to influence. And I try, Bruce, to make sure I always say the Chinese government. The beef is not with the Chinese people. The beef is obviously not with any Chinese Americans. The hate that is being directed to Asian Americans in the United States is outrageous. So I try to be very clear and precise in where my opposition is. So I would say engage our friends and engage the rest of the world on this shared threat. We need to have a counter to the Belt and Road Initiative. When you look at the Chinese are now in 138 countries through the Belt and Road Initiative. Why were we not creating systems when we knew that Huawei and 5G was going into some of these countries to put a package together to help Nokia, to help Samsung in order to be competitive? Why are we always have a national security plan that comes briefed in Congress. We have a national defense plan. We don't have a national economic security plan that talks about some of these issues. So those are the things that we have to be ready for. And then we need to increase track 2 conversations. Track 2 being, India and Pakistan, former generals from both sides and former elected officials meet and have conversations. They go back and back brief the elected officials. But we need to make sure that some of those kinds of informal conversations increase so that there is not a miscommunication or a misread of some kind of behavior. So those are some of the steps that I would advocate to Secretary Blinken and President Biden.
Well, I hope they give you a call. Let me turn something that's very much been in the news lately. The biggest surprise for me in my job over the last 4 years, perhaps, are the number of CEOs who call and want my thoughts as they consider engaging not on tax or on tech policy, but on social issues that were not historically in their wheelhouse. And Some of it is some of it is whether it's their workforce or their customers that they feel they want to be responsive to. Some of it is the sense that there are problems they need to solve. And there's in the major papers today, there was a whole bunch of business leaders who signed on to a big open letter about voting rights, which I talked a little bit about on earlier, both with Ursula Burns, but I had one with Melody Hobson, one of these conversations where she was saying she thinks we've hit civil rights 3.0. She said civil rights 1.0 was the Union Army and Abraham Lincoln. Civil rights 2.0 was Dr. King and the marchers covered by television. She thinks civil rights 3.0 is being led from the C-suite, with business leaders concluding that government's not solving kind of our America's original sin, and that business leaders need to, whether it's that or whether it's climate, it's time to take these big challenges and try to lead. I'm interested in your perspectives on what you're seeing and what you might advise business leaders in that space.
One thing I've learned about power and influence is in the absence of it, that void gets filled, right? And right now, when you don't have on some of these major issues that the majority of Americans are clamoring about and asking for changes, when you don't have the traditional folks that would work on those issues, whether it's local, state, or federal government, that void is going to get filled by people that have the authority to speak about these things and have the ability to implement solutions. And so that's why some of our great business leaders, I think, are wading into this, and their employees are expecting that. Their employees are expecting to work for a company that they believe in and reflects their values. And so I think the internal pressures that CEOs are seeing from their own workplace, but also from their customers. And the reality is some of this change is going to happen because many of these businesses have way better approval than anybody in elected office, right? And so when you have that kind of a brand loyalty and brand awareness, some of it's going to be used. And I think there's a disconnect from some of our elected leaders, especially on these voting issues. I've been critical of the Republican Party and folks even here in my own state on this issue. If you're trying to restrict the number of people that vote, then if you actually engage people prior to elections, you don't have to worry about restricting their ability to vote on election day, right? And if you think you can't grow your party, then maybe you need to rethink your principles. And so I think it's a broader frustration and concern with the direction of our country, and people are clamoring for folks that are in some position to do something. I think that's why you're going to see it continue.
No, I tend to think you're right. I also think normally businesses wouldn't get involved in kind of political operations stuff, and many Republicans would point out that even post changes, the Georgia law is actually easier to vote under than New York's current law. I think part of the challenge as well is though that the why so many Republicans across the country are advancing laws is predicated upon a lie, upon the stop the steal false notion that Donald Trump was somehow defrauded out of elections. So we need to make it tougher when there wasn't the fraud. But it's an interesting and it's a fraud issue.
And Bruce, guess what? Nobody believes if a Republican says that, nobody believes that, right? Because of history and recent history on this. And so make it easier for people to vote. We should be able to authenticate who the voter is. That's not hard, but increase the opportunities. Oh, and by the way, if you believe in local control, why are you restricting what a county is able to do if that is one of your core beliefs? And so part of this is, I think, go back to your earlier question, Bruce, the Republican Party needs to be based on our values, right? And not, things that are politically expedient. I think that's going to see some changes, and we shouldn't be afraid. Let's get more people voting, the better it is. And to meet, and even in Texas, Republican pollster did a recent poll. It's like 85% of Republican primary voters think you should increase the chances for people to vote. Oh, and by the way, who's benefited from mail-in ballots for the last 30 years? Republicans have, right? Like it's just this notion's crazy. And you're right. The 2020 election was not stolen, it was lost because Donald Trump was unable to grow the Republican Party to make it look like the entire country. That was the actual problem. And until we accept that, we're going to continue to see Republicans losing national elections like we've had 7 out of the last 8 times.
All right, I've got 2 last questions for you, Will. First, one is on the so-called black swans. And I'm sure CIA spends a lot of time thinking about these things, but these are the questions that business and government leaders perhaps aren't paying enough attention to. The most obvious one, I don't know, 2 years ago would have been pandemic, which could have happened, and with MERS and SARS, and it was clearly we were going to have one, yet we kind of sleptwalked through it, and we were underprepared in lots of public health ways. What do you think of when you think of risks that are inadequately being addressed?
In 21 years of being associated with the national security community, here's what I've learned about black swans. The only thing black swans do is actually happen. So we have to be prepared for them. And one of the things that I think we're not prepared for is our energy grid. And we saw it here in Texas. This notion that, oh, there's so many, there's so many fail safes in place to protect it. Everything's going to be fine. We saw what happened here in Texas. We saw what happened. I alluded to it earlier in Mumbai. Imagine if right before the United States joined World War II, imagine if we were able to plant bombs in every German manufacturing facility that made tanks, ammunition, and planes. Do you think FDR would have approved that? Yeah, he would have, right? And so imagine the fact that we could assume that the Chinese have been able to do things into our electric grid, and are we prepared for that? So what happens when the lights go out? Do you even have the phone numbers of your senior execs, to be able to coordinate what you need to do, right? Something that basic. If your cell phone doesn't work and you don't have power, how are you going to be able to operate? I think that's a scenario that it might be rectified in a short period of time, but to deal in that period, I think is something that most people are ill prepared for.
Well, that's really scary. So let's end with what I ask everybody at the end, which is always one, reasons for optimism. You're not allowed to say the vaccines because they're awesome and we all get them, but it's been a rough 18 months for so many folks in so many ways. Personally, I've found some silver linings, not least of which, the odds of my being able to get you on a call with friends in California and Florida and elsewhere would have been pretty low, and that I've been able to do these, I've really enjoyed. It's a small reason for optimism for me. But I'm interested in your, what should folks take away as Will Hurd's reasons to be optimistic about the medium and long-term future?
I've always been excited. One of the things that I tried to do when I was in Congress, and I still try to do this now, is I speak in as many schools as I possibly can. I've done hundreds. And when I look at these high schoolers and college kids, they care about their country. They care about solving problems. They care about working together. Like I feel like every generation says that about a future generation, but I wasn't saying that about some of the interns that are coming into my office when I first came in. There's something different about these kids that are like 15, 16, 17 right now. And I think that's amazing. I also think that once we come out of this, we're all going to remember, and we're going to remember this longer than what I think most people expect. We're going to miss seeing some of the people in the office, right? Just having that personal interaction. Like we're going to miss seeing, being able to go to that friend's house. Like I think that the being devoid of some of that contact and that interaction this last year plus has done may make us, or is going to make us, recognize and appreciate the value of this interconnection. And I think it's also going to make us realize that way more unites us than divides us. And I think I think it's going to get a little bit, harder before it gets better. But I think this experience is going to make it, because we're going to crave that.
That's optimistic indeed, and appreciated. Will, thanks so much for making the time. All of your fans who are on this call and those who want me to send them the recording, appreciate your making the time. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, brother. See y'all.
See ya.
Thanks, y'all.